I'm going to tell you the story of what happened to my family during the Second World War. I was brought up in a place called Pinner in North London. It was a peaceful sort of place. I was born in 1946, 1 year after the end of the Second World War, the war we used to call the war. My father was called Harold, my mother was called Connie, and my brother, well, he's called Brian, and we lived in a flat over a shop. My father was an English teacher in a secondary school. My mother was a primary school teacher. My brother and I, we went to local schools. Though things were very peaceful in Pinner, people often talked about the war, and there were often films about the war on at our local cinema. We didn't have a TV. We listened a lot to the radio. My favourite radio programme when I was young was a programme called Journey into Space. My brother and I used to act it out in our bedroom, doing all the voices. Where are you, Lemmy? 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 Go back. My father was born in America, and he had been in the American Army. I used to like wearing his US Army clothes and playing with the things he brought back, like his special plate that's called a canteen. Now, I'm going to read you some poems I wrote about the time when I was a boy. This first one's called In Our Flat. In our flat, faces speak of places across the sea. In our flat, voices walk in talking, but not like me. In our flat, books fly around us saying, never stop saying why. In our flat, stories stroke us until we cry. In our flat there was a mother and father who were born so poor they told us, even if we now have more, no one is worse than you. Things could be fair if we learnt how to share, and they sang a sweet song that said, war is wrong. Find out what's possible, they said. Find out what's possible. Find out what's possible, they said. Find out what's possible. And this poem is called Newcomers. My father came to England from another country. My father's mother came to England from another country. But my father's father stayed behind. So my dad had no dad here, and I never saw him at all. One day in spring, some things arrived, a few old papers, a few old photos, and oh yes, a hulky, bulky, thick-checked jacket that belonged to the man I would have called Grandad, the man who stayed behind. But I kept that jacket, and I wore it, and I wore it, and I wore it, till it wore right through at the back. And this poem is called Mischerdemonk. Mum bursts into our room and looks at the mess. This place is a Mischerdemonk, she says. What's a Mischerdemonk, we say. Well, this place, she says, and walks out. Another time I'd be going out and she'd say, look at you. You don't want to go out looking like a schloch. What's a schloch, I'd say. Well, the thing you don't want to look like, she says. And this poem is called Two Languages. Mum can speak two languages and sometimes mixes them up. She doesn't say, don't moan. She says, don't kvetch. She doesn't say, don't slurp your soup. She says, don't chup. She doesn't say, don't burp. She says, don't graps. And she doesn't say, don't fart. She says, don't fots. And when I have wrinkles in my socks, she says it looks like I've put my feet through a pile of bagels. So she says, well, take the bagels out of your socks. So I sing it all back to her. Don't kvetch, don't chup, don't graps, don't fots. Take the bagels out of your socks. And we all sing it. Don't kvetch, don't chup, don't graps, don't fots. Take the bagels out of your socks. And this poem is called Ships. A ship in a bottle sails down the mantelpiece. A ship in a photo brings Grandma here. Ships they talk and talk about. Ships far and near. How did the ship get in the bottle? Ships by night and by day. Ships they talk and talk about. Why did Grandma come to stay? Who put the ship in the bottle? Ships that they once knew. Ships they talk and talk about. Why didn't Grandad come too? When did the ship go in the bottle? Ships sailing far and near. Ships they talk and talk about. Who else didn't come here? Who broke the ship in the bottle? Can anyone tell me why? Ships they talk and talk about. And why did the baby die? And this poem is called Sisters, Brothers. When we talk about sisters and brothers and fathers and mothers, when it comes to my dad, there's always a place where there's a bit of a space. It's a gap with no one there. It's a father, a dad, over there somewhere. When we talk about sisters and brothers and fathers and mothers, and we get to the sisters and brothers of my father's father, he shuts his eyes and says he'd rather not talk about that. But we ask for their names and where they are, where do they live, and is it far? And bit by bit he tells us their names, none of them here, there was a war, he explains. And we sit and we think about us sitting here, how sisters and brothers could just disappear, but because Mum and Dad were in a different place, they could stay here where they were safe. My mother and father were able to survive, and here we are now, and we're all alive. Now, you can tell from those poems that my parents spoke some words from another language. That language is called Yiddish, and they spoke it because their grandparents and great-grandparents came from Poland, Russia, Lithuania, and Romania. It's a language that was spoken by Jewish people who came from there. Now, there was one story that used to bother me that my father told, and it went like this. It's called The French Uncles. Every now and then my father would say, I had 2 French uncles. They were in France at the beginning of the war. They weren't there at the end. What happened to them, we'd say. Don't know, he'd usually say. All I know is that they were there at the beginning of the war, and they weren't there at the end. And when we got a bit older, when we asked what happened to them, he'd say, maybe they died in the camps. The camps? What did that mean? This was in around 1954 or 55. Like I said, we didn't have a TV, and I don't remember people talking about the camps. Now, maybe you know what that means. It usually means concentration camps, or labour camps, or even worse, extermination camps. What my father was saying was that he thought that his French uncles had been killed in one of these camps, but he didn't know how, or when, or where. And at that time, there was no way of finding out that I knew of. My father didn't seem to know either. So that was that. Apart from one other thing, that is, my father's cousin Michael. This is what I've written about how I met Michael. Same name as me, eh? So this is called Cousin Michael. There was a wedding and we were invited, and when we got there, there was a man who they said was my father's cousin. This is Michael, they said, same name as you. Ha! And at one point in the wedding, my aunt took me to one side and said that there was a time during the war when Michael was a boy, 16 or 17, no older than you are now, she said, and his parents said to him that it wasn't going to be safe where they were in Poland. And so my aunt said his parents put him on a train and he never saw them again. Like it always was at that time when people told me things like this, my aunt just shrugged, looked sad, and said, I suppose they died in the camps. And I never knew what that meant. What were these camps? Why were people taken there? At the wedding, I watched him. He must have been about 40 years old then. In my mind, I thought of him being the same age as me. And I imagined my parents, who were at the wedding too, saying to me one day, Michael, Go, don't stay. There are soldiers and police, and they're kicking us out of our houses and flats. Go, don't stay. So they come with me to a station, and we wait for a train, and all the time we're looking out for soldiers and police, but it's okay. So they hug me and kiss me, and I get on the train and stand in the corridor and wave to them through the window, and I can see them close together, waving, and then there's a shout and a whistle, and the train starts to pull off, and they wave, and they wave, and I wave, and I wave, till they're gone. And that's the last I ever see of them. I never see them again. But wherever I go and whoever I'm with, I remember that picture of them standing together, waving me off, and for the rest of my life, I can't make any of it make sense that they did that. They did that thing of making me safe, and there was nothing they could do for themselves. And I think again and again of what they might have been thinking at that moment as they waved and stood close to each other. What did they think as they lost everything and later they were herded together and taken to a camp, never knowing what had happened, never knowing why this was happening, never knowing what happened to me, even at the very end as they were closing their eyes. And though I smile and walk about in the world, I carry this with me wherever I am, whoever I'm with, and no matter how many times I try to change it, no matter how many times I try to get them to come with me on the train, or how many times I get them to escape and find me in those freezing places where I ended up, or how many times I imagine that I meet them after the war is over and we hug and kiss and cry, it never happens. It never happens. There is always nothing. Nothing but nothing. But I walk about in the world, smiling and nodding. I even go to weddings and people smile at me. Even this young man with the same name as me, no older than I was then when my parents put me on the train, and he's looking at me like he's trying to read me like a book. And that was that. Oh, there was one other thing. When I was about 12, we did get a TV. And a few years after that, one night my father and I watched a French documentary film about what happened during the war in France. Or more precisely, what happened to Jews in France during the war. From that, I learnt about more than 76,000 Jews were deported out of France to camps in Germany and Poland, and hardly any of them came back. Now, as my father and I watched the film, he said, this must have been what happened to my uncles. He knew a bit more that he told us bit by bit as well. Their names, he said, were Oscar and Martin. So that's Oscar Rosen and Martin Rosen. And he said that one of them was a watch and clock mender, and the other one, he thought, was a dentist. And he said that he thought they lived in towns on the east side of France. He named some of those towns: Strasbourg, Nancy, Metz. And that was it. As I got older, this started to bother me. You see, the great plan of the Nazis, who were ruling in Germany at the time, was to create what they thought was some kind of pure super race of human beings. Part of their plan was to get rid of all people who got in the way of this. So, and this is awful, they tried to kill people they thought were mentally ill from the time they were born. They tried to kill nomadic people, people who we call Roma and Sinti these days, but were called then gypsies. And they tried to kill Jews. They also wanted land to the east of Germany, and that meant killing people who lived there, such as Polish and Russian people, who the Nazis thought were inferior. So if the Nazis had succeeded in killing my father's uncles, that was part of the plan to get rid of all the Jews. But the Nazis had another plan to get rid of all memory of Jews, to get rid of Jewish culture and religion and traditions. What bothered me about that was the Nazis had succeeded in doing that with my father's uncles. I didn't know what had happened to them. Obviously, I couldn't bring them back. I couldn't make them come alive again. But could I find out what happened? What happened to them? And who they were? So I tried to find out with the little bits of information I had. I went to America to meet my father's cousins. My father's cousins called Ted and Olga. The French uncles were their uncles too. All that I picked up was that my father's cousin Olga had once written to one of the uncles, and he had written back. "Have you still got the letter?" I said. "No," she said. "All I remember," she said, "was that one of them lived in a road called Rue de Thionville." That was a clue. I did what I could to find someone called Rosen who lived in Rue de Thionville before the war. Nope. Nothing. Then all of a sudden, something amazing happened. A distant relative died, and he left behind in his papers some letters. 4 letters. 2 were from Oscar, remember, one of my father's uncles, and 2 were from Michael's mother, called Stella, who was my father's aunt, and she lived in Poland. 4 letters. Here they are. They're writing for help. 2 from France, 2 from Poland. Stella in Poland is asking her brother Max in America to take in her son Michael, who you know about. As you know from my poem, in the end, Michael got to England after the war. The other 2 are from my father's uncle, Oscar. And here was the thing about my father's uncle, Oscar. On his letter, there was an address. But it was on the west side of France, not in the east, where my father said he lived. Oh, why would that be? Then I found out that when the war started, millions of people in the east fled to places in the west. Then I did more looking, and I found a book that was all about what happened to Jews in the part of France where Oscar was staying. I ordered it, I opened it, and there was a Rosen living at that same address in the book. Sure enough, the book said he was a clock-mender. But what else? It said he was married to someone called Rachel. And then I read that he had to wear, or both of them had to wear, a yellow star with the word Jew on it, in French, juif. And he had to put Jewish business on his market stall, in French, entreprise juive. And he had to hand over all his belongings. Then I found out that he and his wife Rachel had run away, but then found out they were captured in a city called Nice, and then sent on a train to a camp near Paris, and then put on another train and sent to the terrible extermination camp called Auschwitz. And they never came back. Now, this left me with several mysteries that I'll come back to in a moment. First, why Nice? Second, was it really Oscar, because the Rosen man in the book fitted everything else, but this Rosen was called Yeshia. I'll spell that, Jeschie, Yeshia. Now, Jewish people usually have 2 names, the name they use at school and work, and the religious name alongside it. So was Oscar's religious name Yeshia, or something like that? Meanwhile, I found out more about these trains. They were called convoys, and they were made up of cattle trucks. Yes, Yeshia, or Oscar, and Rachel were put on convoy 1962, on November the 20th, 1943, just 3 years before I was born. And he's put on that train with 1,200 other Jewish people, men, women and children, no toilets, no food, for 3 days across France, across Germany, into Poland, locked into these trucks. Now, what about my other problem? Why Nice? Nice is a beautiful resort by the seaside with great big beautiful hotels. Well, I found out that Oscar and Rachel had escaped from the town where they were living and somehow or another travelled hundreds of miles across France to Nice. The reason why was because Jewish people heard at this time that if they got to Nice, they would be safe. In the rest of France, the Nazis were rounding up Jews, or the French police were doing it for them, and sending them out of the country, and they weren't coming back. But in Nice and around Nice, the Italians were ruling there. The Italians, people said, were not rounding up Jews and sending them away. At this very moment, a man called Angelo Donati had a great idea. He would get hold of 4 big ships, and all the Jews who wanted to escape from Nice could travel on these ships to North Africa, where they would be safe. But, now this bit gets a bit complicated. The Italians were on the same side as the Germans at this moment in the war. So the people fighting the Nazis, we call them the Allies, and Britain was part of the Allies, were also fighting the Italians. And it was at this very moment the Allies defeated the Italians, beat the Italians. Well, what did that mean? That would mean that the Italians would leave Nice and the Nazis would come in and the Jews wouldn't be safe anymore. So Angelo Donati, said to the general leading the Allies, please don't announce the fact you've defeated Italy or the Nazis will come in. But sad to say, the general did announce it. And 3 days later, the Nazis invaded Nice, and there were people like my father's uncle and aunt waiting in the hotels, waiting for Donati to get the boats ready, and so they were arrested, sent to the camp near Paris called Drancy, and then deported on Convoy 62 to Auschwitz. So this is what I've written about that. Oscar, what did you think as you and Rachel sat on the floor of the cattle truck as it left Paris? Did you think of the watches and clocks you had mended? Did you think of the tiny springs and wheels? You with your magnifying glass in your eye, poring over the work so that a monsieur or a madame could tell the time correct to the exact second? Did you think of the smell of the sea and the push of a boat against the waves? How you and Rachel would stand on the deck, the wind in your faces, as you sailed away? Did you look through the gaps in the slats on the side of the truck? Did you see farmers in fields, women selling clothes in a market? Did you call out? Did you push your hands through the gaps? Did the night come creeping in? Did you see a light from a window where people sat and ate their evening meal? Did you see in the dark horror on Rachel's face? Did she see horror on yours? Did you shut her eyes? Did she shut yours? Thinking of children who shut their eyes to make the world go away? And then behind your eyelids, did you think of the cattle that had once stood in the truck as they were taken away to the slaughterhouse? Now, what about my other problem, the Oscar Yeshia problem? All the documents I found called the person who fitted the description as Yeshia, but my father and relatives in America called him Oscar. Was it really the same person? Then I found that my father's cousin Olga in America before the war had written to the government in America to try to get Oscar Yeshia to come to America. What did she call him in that document? Yeshia. So it was the same person with those two names. But what about the other uncle? Wasn't he called Martin? Well, after a lot of digging around on the internet, I found out that just a few weeks after Oscar Yeshia, as I'll call him, was arrested and deported, the very same thing happened to Martin. This time, this happened in a village in northwest France called Saint-Hermine. This is what I've written about my father's uncle Martin, or Martin as you'd say in French, who was living in the village of Saint-Hermine. On January the 31st, 1944, at 2:30 in the morning in a village in France, 4 policemen knock on the door of a woman who has several lodgers in her house. They take away one of them, a man who's done nothing wrong. They take him to a nearby town to put him with 30 others who've done nothing wrong. He's taken away with them and put on a train to where he and they are put with hundreds of others who've done nothing wrong. He's then taken away by a train, carrying more than 1,000 people to another country, where he's put with thousands and thousands of others who've done nothing wrong, and he was killed. Martin Rosen, my father's uncle, 1890 to 1944. There is a report in the archives of the département, that's like a county, of the Vendée in western France, which says that on the 31st of January 1944, officers Salomon, Mazoin and Cambanetto, under command of Adjutant Le Papu, from Fontenay-le-Comte station in the Saint-Hermine Brigade, acting on instructions from Prefect Monsieur Gaston Jamet, according to the ordinance of January the 20th, 1944, called at 2:30 in the morning at the living quarters of Martin Rosen in a property owned by Madame Bobière née Meunier in the village of Saint-Hermine in the Vendée. The officers say in their report that Martin Rosen opened the door and that they took him and drove him to the station. Martin Rosen, the report goes on, was born on the 18th of August 1890 at Krośniewice in Poland, jeweller, son of Jonas and Rachel, naturalized French, Jewish race, 1.62 meters, brown eyes, oval face, straight nose, regular mouth, dressed in yellow cotton trousers and grey cotton jacket, wearing a Basque beret and low-heeled shoes, scar on his left cheek. He was taken to the parish hall at La Roche-sur-Yon, where he met up with 30 other Jews taken that night. They were taken to the train station, put on a wagon for La Rochelle, then Poitiers, then Drancy internment camp. From there he was taken to Paris Bobigny station, put on Convoy 68 on February the 10th, and taken to Auschwitz. And from the archives of La Vendée, there is more. On March the 28th, 1944, Madame Bobière wrote to the prefect of Vendée at Roche-sur-Yon, to Monsieur Jamet, informing him that the Felt gendarmerie and the gendarmerie came to her house on January the 31st and took Mr. Rosen, of Jewish nationality, who had been staying in her house for more than a year. A wicker basket containing some linen belonging to Mr. Rosen has been left in the room, which had been sealed up by the gendarmes. That means the police. In this room, Madame Bobière writes, is my furniture, including a large cupboard containing things that are indispensable for my personal use, sheets, clothes, linen, blankets, and family papers. Besides that, Rosen's brother-in-law, who lives in the next room and who is French, would look after the wicker basket, which is the only piece of furniture belonging to Rosen. I, says Madame Bobière, am 71 years old and infirm, which means ill, I have the honour of soliciting your goodwill, that means asking you, please, in taking off the seals, they're kind of locks, to this room. I thank you, Monsieur le Préfet, and hope you will accept my respectful compliments. Madame Bobière. So, on the 15th of April, the Prefect, Monsieur Gaston Jamet, who was the person who sent out the ordinance, that means a kind of order, to round up the Jews in the Vendée, informed Madame Bobière that she would only be able to take the seals, those locks, off as and when the occupation authorities will allow it. That was the Germans. Gaston Jamet, who had sent out orders to round up the Jews of Vendée, had been ordered to do so by Monsieur Louis Bourguin, prefect of the region, who had received orders to do so from Pierre Laval, chief of the government, in conjunction with the chief of the regional security police, the Sicherheitspolizei, Karl Hermann Herold, who acted under instructions from his superior officers, Helmut Knochen and Heinz Rödtke, both based in Paris. Martin Rosen is my father's uncle. He didn't return from Auschwitz. His name is engraved on the commemorative wall at the Museum of the Shoah in Paris. Shoah means the Holocaust. There is a plaque on the wall in La Roche-sur-Yon, where the parish hall used to be, commemorating the roundup of January the 30th and 31st, 1944. So now I had found out what had happened to my father's uncles. But there's a bit more. Do you remember I went to America to see my father's cousins? I met Olga and I met Ted. Do you remember they couldn't tell me any more than what my father had told me? But then Olga died and Ted died. He was 103 years old. Amazing. Then Ted's wife died, and after that, Ted's son Teddy went into the house and looked around. There was a cupboard, which he opened. In the cupboard, there was a box. The box was sealed up with sticky tape, and on the box it said, "Family Photos." Teddy opened it, and in the box there were photos of Oscar. Here he is in the First World War. Here he is with his wife Rachel on the day of their engagement. So this is Oscar, Yeshia, and Martin with his wife Lucie Thérèse. And there were pictures of other brothers and sisters. And even one of Michael, you remember him, walking down a street with his mother Stella and his aunt Bella. Teddy sent me these pictures. And I sent the pictures to Michael's sons, and they showed Michael. He hadn't seen that picture ever before. He was mesmerised when he looked at it, his son said. You see, he hadn't seen his mother and father from the time he fled east to get away from the Nazis way back in 1941. Turns out he was sent to a hard labour camp cutting trees in Russia. Then he joined what was called the Polish Free Army and fought with them for months and months until in the end he came to England. He tried to find out what happened to his parents and his other relatives. Well, this is what his wife told me happened to one of them. This is called Leosia. When the Nazis came in the West in Poland, Leosia pretended to be a Christian. She put a crucifix round her neck, and then she fetched her grandmother's brooch and took the diamonds off it. And she took the soles off the heels of her shoes, put the diamonds inside the heels, and put the soles back on. She thought if there were going to be any problems, she'd be able to sell them. Then she went west into Germany. In Germany, she worked in a factory. No one ever found out that she was Jewish. At the end of the war, she couldn't face going back to Poland. Her parents, all her friends and all her relations had been taken away to the camps and killed. She went to Israel to find her brother Naphtali. She told him how she had lived right through the war with diamonds in the heels of her shoes. I knew if ever I got into difficulty, I could have sold them and maybe paid someone to help me. And here they are, she said, the very diamonds themselves. And Naphtali said, "Where did you get the diamonds from, Laosha?" And Laosha said, "Well, from our grandmother's brooch." So Naphtali said, "Listen carefully, Laosha. Many years ago, our grandmother wrote to me. She said that grandfather's business wasn't going too well, and so to help out, she had taken the diamonds off her brooch and put in glass ones instead and sold off the diamonds. She didn't tell anyone about it, but she wrote to me to get it off her chest. You see, you went through the whole war with nothing more than bits of glass in the heels of your shoes." Anyway, now I had photos that got me researching things on the internet about the armies that Oscar and Martin had been in during the First World War. This is what I've written about it. Late at night, I'm groping through the internet and I find that my father's uncle Oscar fought in the First World War in the Kaiserlich und Königlich Regiment, number 56. It's a Polish regiment who fight alongside the German army in the Austro-Hungarian army. Another night, I find that my father's uncle Martin fought in the First World War in the 2e Régiment Étranger. It's a French regiment who fight against the Austro-Hungarian army. After the First World War, they lived near each other in France, near enough for Martin to be best man at Oscar's wedding. Fighting with the German army didn't save Uncle Oscar. He was deported from France by the German security police to Auschwitz and never came back. Fighting with the French army didn't save Uncle Martin. He was arrested by the French police, handed over to the German security police, deported to Auschwitz, and never came back. So, is that the end? Well, not quite, because in France there are what are called archives, places where documents are kept. And also there's a museum in Paris dedicated to all the Jews who were taken away from France. And in the village where Martin was arrested, the mayor of the village wants to remember how Martin lived there and was arrested. So here is me next to the wall of names in Paris, and you can see Yeshia's name. Oh, maybe you can see Martin's name. And here's the wall of names in Nice, and you can see their names too. And here is a Jewish cemetery in Sedan, and you can see Oscar and Rachel's names there too. And here in the village where Martin was arrested, you can see where he was staying. Yes, thanks to the mayor, Monsieur Philippe Barret, is Martin's name on the war memorial. And something else, they've named a local park after him. And here's me reading out Oscar Yeshia's name at a ceremony marking the departure of Convoy 62 from Paris. And here's me reading out Martin's name at a ceremony marking the departure of Convoy 68 from Paris. And because the mayor of the village did these things in his village, one day he got a letter. And this is what it said. Memories, sad memories. We used to come from school to Saint-Hermine. Coming into the village on the right was the police station, which has become Le Massy. Opposite the police station, a large house where an old lady rented out furnished rooms, which is today the Banque Crédit Agricole. One of her rooms was lived in by a very, very old gentleman, old to my eyes, more or less 8 years old as I was then. Every morning he waited for us by the side of the road. We didn't ever miss saying to him, "Good morning, Monsieur Martin," and he would reply, "Good morning, children. Always work hard at school." And in the evening he was there for us saying, "Good evening, children. See you tomorrow, maybe." How I found him to be so nice with his white hair, his blue eyes and his gay smile when he saw us, and so sad when we left. And then I was fascinated by this enormous yellow star sewn onto the black coat that he always wore. I didn't know anything at all about the significance of it. And then one day there was no Monsieur Martin any more, nor the next day or the days after that. I learned from one of my little friends that he had been arrested by the police. Then I forgot about Monsieur Martin. When you're 8 years old, someone arrested by the police can only be a thief of some kind or a bad person. And then one day in March 1952, just when I'd got a job at the town hall as a secretary, a letter came containing a judgment announcing the death of someone by the name of Rosen Gilmaier, known as Martin, whose last place of habitation was Saint-Hermine. And everything came back to me of a face, and I got to know this terrible story. The only crime committed by Monsieur Martin was that he was a Jew, and he died because he was deported to Auschwitz. He was 54 years old. His death certificate contained the sentence, "Died for France." Later, in May 2001, a document came to the town hall asking to add an official statement on his death, "Died in deportation." It's important that Monsieur Martin's name is on the war memorial in the village. It's very unusual that I came this way these days, on the way to Luçon, without lifting my eyes up to the window of his room, first on the left, on the first floor, and it seems as if I can see him there, smiling, so sadly. And this is from Jeanne Baradeau, schoolchild in Saint-Hermine, secretary in the town hall, 1951 to 1994. So, as I said, of course I couldn't bring back Oscar and Martin, but I could push back against that idea that the Nazis had that they could wipe out their memory. I found out what once seemed to be lost when my father said all those years ago, "I had 2 French uncles living in France before the war. They were there before the war, but they weren't there after the war." And when we asked what happened to them, you remember he said, "I don't know." Now I know, and you know something of what happened. Why it happened, though, is another story for another day. Before I finish, there's another story. What I've told you is full of bad things, bad stuff, but there's one story I heard that tells a different story. I read an article about the train that took my great-uncle and my great-aunt, Yeshia and Rachel, to Auschwitz, a train Convoy 62. The article said that some of the prisoners on Convoy 62 escaped from the train while it was in a tunnel. One of the prisoners was called Oscar Handschuh, and when he jumped from the train, he knocked himself out. After a bit, he came round and headed off into the countryside. And he arrived at a farm and asked for help, and the people there were called Mariette and Marcel Médard. They bandaged his head, gave him clothing and food, and hid him in an attic. That day, German soldiers came to the farm. They said they were looking for 10 Jews who had jumped from a train. Marcel Médard said that there was no one in the house. Oscar Handschuh stayed with them for several days until he felt better. Then the Médards gave him money and clothes. One of their children went with him by train to Paris to make sure he was all right. Later, the war ended. For many years, the Handschuh family stayed in touch with the Médard family. Oscar Handschuh knew, and the Médard family knew, that if Oscar had been found by the soldiers that day, Oscar would have been killed, and the Médard family would have been killed.